February 1st, 1959. The Ural Mountains. Northern Russia. The temperature on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl has dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold that does not announce itself. It simply removes warmth from the world, quietly, methodically, the way water drains from a basin. The stars above are ferocious in their clarity, burning white against a sky so dark it seems carved from obsidian. There is no moon. There is no sound except the wind, and even that sound seems distant, as if the mountain is listening rather than breathing. A canvas tent sits anchored to the slope at roughly 1,100 meters above sea level. It sags slightly under the weight of packed snow, its guy ropes humming a low, nearly inaudible note in the wind. From inside, warmth. From inside, voices. Laughter. Quiet, exhausted. The kind of laughter that comes at the end of a long day when the body is spent but the spirit is still lit. Someone is telling a joke. Someone else groans. The sound of a tin cup scraped against a metal surface. The rustle of sleeping bags. A match struck. The soft hiss of a kerosene lamp turned low. Inside that tent are 9 people. Young people, mostly in their early 20s. University students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk. They are on a Category 3 hiking expedition, the highest difficulty rating available in the Soviet classification system. They are experienced. They are laughing. They are, by every measure, exactly where they planned to be. They do not know that in a matter of hours, every single one of them will be dead. They do not know that their deaths, scattered across this frozen slope and the dark forest below, will be so strange, so deeply disturbing, so fundamentally resistant to explanation, that investigators will close the file more than 60 years later with an answer that satisfies almost no one. They do not know that the mountain has a name, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people, that translates roughly as, the Dead Mountain. Inside the tent, the lamp flickers. One of the hikers shifts in their sleeping bag. Outside, the wind changes, a subtle shift in direction, almost nothing, the kind of atmospheric detail you would never notice unless you had been born into this landscape, unless you understood what this mountain does when it decides to speak. And then something happens. We do not know exactly what. That is the truth, and that truth is the reason this story has haunted the world for more than 6 decades. But what we know, what the evidence tells us with absolute certainty, is that within moments of that change in the air, something inside that tent caused 9 experienced, rational, well-equipped adults to do something that defies every instinct for survival. They cut the tent open from the inside. Not unzipped. Not opened from the entrance. Cut. Torn from within, with a knife, with desperate hands, slashing outward through the fabric. And then they ran. Out into the dark. Into the -30-degree night. Without shoes. Without coats. Without waiting. Without looking back. What happened on that mountain? No one, not the Soviet government, not the KGB, not 6 decades of investigators, has ever been able to say for certain. To understand what was lost on Kholat Syakhl, you first need to understand who these people were. Because this is not simply a mystery. It is a human story, 9 individual lives, each one distinct, each one carrying the weight of personality and hope and ordinary ambition. When we reduce them to victims, we lose something true. Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov was 23 years old. He was the kind of person who attracted gravity, quiet, enormously competent, the sort of leader who never needed to raise his voice. He had designed and built his own radio equipment. He had led multiple hiking expeditions through the Urals before. He was, by the assessment of everyone who knew him, precisely the kind of person you wanted in charge when things went wrong. His girlfriend, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Zina, everyone called her, was on the expedition too. 22 years old. Bright, physically strong, effortlessly charismatic. The kind of person around whom a group organizes itself without anyone quite noticing it happening. Yuri Doroshenko was tall and broad-shouldered and tended to be the one doing the heaviest lifting, and doing it with a grin. Georgy Krivonischenko was the photographer and the camp comedian, the one who could make the hardest nights feel lighter. Rustem Slobodin was a mechanical engineer with a fondness for music. He played the mandolin. Alexander Kolevatov was serious, methodical, the one who remembered to check the maps twice. Nikolai Thibault-Brignolel, Thibault to his friends, was a geology student with a French surname inherited from a distant ancestor, and he carried that name with a kind of cheerful pride. And then there were two who stand slightly apart in every account of this expedition. Two figures whose presence adds a particular layer of mystery to everything that follows. Alexander Zolotaryov, known as Sasha, was the oldest of the group at 37, joining almost as an afterthought, having transferred onto the expedition late. He was an instructor with the Komsomol hiking club. He was friendly. He was experienced. But he was not entirely known. And Ludmila Dubinina, Luda, 20 years old, fierce, passionate, one of the strongest hikers in the group and reportedly the most vocal, was the kind of person whose absence from a room you noticed immediately. 9 people. All of them trained. All of them, by every account, exactly the kind of people who should have survived whatever the Urals could throw at them. The expedition had begun in late January. They traveled by train from Sverdlovsk to Ivdel, then by truck to the last settlement with a name, a small village called Vizhay. From there, they entered the wilderness on foot, pulling supplies on a sled, moving through birch forests that gradually thinned and then surrendered entirely to open tundra. They kept a group diary, multiple members contributing entries, the tone shifting between dry factual notation and brief, affectionate observations. On one of the last full days before everything changed, someone wrote that the weather was difficult but the spirits were high. That the forest was beautiful. That they were moving well. On the evening of January 31st, they camped in a valley at the edge of the forest. The plan was to ascend the slope of Kholat Syakhl the following day, cache some of their supplies, and then descend to the valley of the Lozva River for the night. The weather began to deteriorate. Wind picked up. Visibility dropped. Sometime during the afternoon of February 1st, this is where the precision of the record ends, they made a navigational error. Instead of angling into the valley for shelter, they continued up the slope. By the time they realized, the conditions had worsened enough that descending in the dark seemed more dangerous than staying where they were. So Igor Dyatlov made the decision every competent wilderness leader dreads. They would dig in on the exposed slope, pitch the tent, and wait for morning. It was a reasonable decision. It was exactly what experienced hikers are trained to do. But somewhere in that night, in the hours between settling in and the moment someone put a knife through the tent wall, something changed everything. 25 days passed before anyone went looking. The group had planned to arrive at Vizhay by February 12th and send a telegram confirming their safe return. When no telegram arrived, the families were not immediately alarmed. Delays were common in wilderness expeditions, weather could push timelines by days. By February 20th, alarm had become impossible to suppress any longer. A search party was organized. Students, instructors, eventually military and police. They spread into the mountains. On February 26th, searchers found the tent. It was still standing on the slope of Kholat Syakhl, partially buried under wind-packed snow. And as the searchers approached, what they saw did not yet make sense. It required a moment of standing still, of looking, before the wrongness of it fully registered. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Multiple cuts. Not one clean slash but several, some only partially complete, as if made by hands that were desperate but also, perhaps, imprecise in the dark. The entrance was still tied shut. No one had left through the door. Inside the tent, the searchers found everything the hikers owned. Boots, coats, extra clothing, food, the camp stove, a camera, The group diary. All of it there, undisturbed, as if the 9 people who owned these things had simply stepped outside for a moment and hadn't come back. No signs of a struggle inside the tent. Nothing knocked over. Nothing broken. Just the slashes in the fabric, and the absence of the people who had made them. Below the tent, leading away down the slope toward the tree line almost 1.5 kilometers away, were footprints. 9 sets. Moving quickly, purposefully, in a tight group. And here is the detail that first stops every person who encounters this case. The footprints showed that most of the hikers were either barefoot or wearing only socks. In negative 30-degree temperatures. On hard-packed snow. They ran without their shoes. Whatever drove them out of that tent was more terrifying to them than the cold. That is the first, fundamental, deeply disturbing fact of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Something, some presence, some sound, some sensation, some threat, was worse than the certainty of freezing to death in the dark. And what they found next made no sense. The footprints led to the tree line. At the edge of the forest, near a large Siberian cedar tree, rescuers found the first 2 bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko. They were lying near the remnants of a fire. A small fire, clearly built with desperate urgency, using branches from the cedar above. Both were shoeless. Both were dressed only in light clothing, nowhere near sufficient for the temperature. Their hands showed signs of burns. Someone had been feeding that fire with their bare hands, shoving branches into it against the cold. The burns told the story of how badly they needed the warmth, how much they were willing to endure to keep it alive. But they were dead. The cause, as the medical examiner would later determine, was hypothermia. Searchers found broken branches on the cedar up to 5 meters above the ground. Someone had climbed that tree in the dark, in the freezing cold, in inadequate clothing, and broken branches on the way up and on the way down. Why? The most plausible suggestion is that they were trying to see something, or trying to get away from something below. No one can say which. Not far from the cedar, between the tree line and the tent, they found 3 more bodies. Igor Dyatlov himself, at roughly 300 meters from the cedar, his body partially covered by snow, lying on his back, his face turned toward the tent. One arm raised slightly, as if in the act of trying to get up, or of being stopped. Zinaida Kolmogorova, Zina, was found about 500 meters from the cedar, also face down in the snow, also facing the tent. And between them, Rustam Slobodin, lying on his side. All 3 showed signs of hypothermia. All 3 appeared, from the position of their bodies, to have been trying to get back to the tent. They had died trying to return. Whatever had driven them out had, perhaps, passed. And then they had tried to come back. And the cold had taken them before they could get there. The remaining 4 were not found for 2 more months. It was May, spring, the snow beginning to melt, when searchers working methodically through a ravine roughly 70 meters from the cedar finally located them beneath nearly 4 meters of packed snow. They had been sheltering in what appeared to be an improvised den, a deliberate structure built to provide some insulation against the wind. Someone, even in the chaos of whatever was happening, had tried to build a survival structure. But this was only the beginning of the strangeness. Because when the medical examiners looked at these last 4 bodies, they found something that changed the entire character of the investigation. The first 5 deaths, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, Doroshenko, Krivonischenko, had yielded a consistent cause. Hypothermia. Tragic, inexplicable in its circumstances, but medically unremarkable. The cold had killed them. That was something that could be written on a form, filed, understood. The last 4 were different. Nicholas Thibault Brignolel had a massive skull fracture. Not a surface wound. A deep, catastrophic fracture of the temporal bone. The kind of injury the medical examiner compared to the force of a car accident. There was no corresponding wound on the skin. No bruising, No lacerations on the outside of the head. The damage was internal. Something had crushed the bone from the inside out, or had delivered a blow so powerful it broke the skull without breaking the skin. Alexander Zolotaryov had multiple broken ribs on both sides of his chest. Not one side, not a single impact, both sides. 5 ribs on the right, 3 on the left, all fractured. The medical examiner noted the same characteristic as the skull fracture. The damage was severe, the kind associated with enormous physical force, but there was no external bruising commensurate with what the bones told. As if the force had been applied not from outside the body but from within, or from some direction that the physics of normal trauma cannot readily explain. Lyudmila Dubinina and Zolotaryov both had fractures of a similar kind, and Dubinina had something else. Something that, when it was first noted in the original autopsy reports, was so disturbing that investigators initially suppressed the detail. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue. And her eyes. The soft tissue of the face, the eyes, the tongue, portions of the lips, was simply gone. The official explanation, offered quietly and without conviction, was post-mortem decomposition. That the body, submerged in the snowmelt that had formed in the ravine, had suffered tissue damage from the water and the time. It is a medically possible explanation. It is not a satisfying one. Because the other bodies in the ravine did not show the same degree of soft tissue loss. And because the tongue and the eyes, the specific organs missing, are not typically the first to decompose. And because several investigators who examined the case over the following decades noted that the pattern of missing tissue was not consistent with natural decomposition. And then there was the radiation. When the clothing of several victims was tested, specifically the garments recovered from Krivonischenko and Dubinina, they showed elevated levels of beta radiation. Not dramatically off the charts, not lethal levels, but measurably above background. Enough that the testing laboratory flagged it. Enough that it was included in the official investigation file. And enough that, for decades afterward, it would feed a particular branch of speculation about what might have happened on that slope. And then investigators found one more thing. One detail that has never been satisfactorily explained, that sits in the record like a splinter that cannot be removed. The skin of several victims had an unusual orange or brownish discoloration. Not bruising, the wrong color, the wrong pattern. Something that pathologists at the time attributed to decomposition and the effects of the environment, but which subsequent reviewers have found inadequate as an explanation. The color of their skin was wrong in a way that normal death does not produce. There was also this. Multiple witnesses, including search team members and people in the surrounding region, reported having seen strange glowing orbs or lights in the sky over the Urals in the nights around early February 1959. Several of these witnesses gave formal statements to investigators. The lights were described as moving in ways inconsistent with aircraft, as exhibiting colors, orange, yellowish-white, that no conventional explanation accounts for cleanly. Soviet investigators formally concluded, in their official close of the case in May 1959, that the deaths were caused by a compelling natural force of unknown origin. That phrase, a compelling natural force of unknown origin, is remarkable for its candor and its evasion simultaneously. It tells you that they had no answer. It does not tell you what they thought the answer might be. And in the Soviet Union of 1959, what the government chose not to say was often more revealing than what it said. The case was classified, sealed. The families of the victims were told not to ask questions. Several of the investigators, in later years, would say privately that the investigation had been interfered with, that evidence had been removed, that they had been instructed to reach conclusions before they had finished examining the facts. The official file was closed, but the questions remained, and they grew. Over the following decades, as details of the case slowly emerged, through leaked documents, persistent journalists, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the consequent partial opening of archives, and eventually the Internet, the Dyatlov Pass incident became what it remains today. one of the most analyzed, most debated, most genuinely unresolved mysteries in modern history. Dozens of theories have been proposed. Most of them are reasonable. Most of them are also, on examination, incomplete. The most persistent mainstream explanation is an avalanche, or a related snow event. The slope of Kholat Syakhl, at the grade where the tent was pitched, is not steep enough for a conventional avalanche under normal conditions. But conditions were not normal. The hikers had cut into the slope to level the tent, potentially destabilizing the snow above them. A slab avalanche, where a layer of compacted snow shears away from the slope and slides as a single mass, could have struck the tent without warning, creating the sudden, overwhelming urge to flee. Slab avalanches move silently and very fast. They can produce exactly the kind of catastrophic internal injuries, the broken ribs, the skull fracture, without leaving commensurate surface wounds, because the pressure is distributed differently than a direct blow. In 2019, the Russian prosecutor's office reopened the investigation and, in 2020, officially concluded that the deaths were caused by an avalanche. Specifically, a delayed avalanche triggered by the hikers' campsite construction, which drove them from the tent and led to their deaths in the cold and forest below. Some researchers found this conclusion persuasive. Many did not. The problem with the avalanche theory is not that it is impossible. It is that it leaves too much unexplained. The slope gradient is marginal for a slab avalanche. The tent, when found, had not been buried under the kind of debris a slab avalanche would leave. It was standing, partially open, with belongings inside still arranged as if recently inhabited. If a slab had struck hard enough to fracture skulls and shatter rib cages, there should have been more evidence of that impact on the tent and its contents. And no avalanche explains the radiation. No avalanche explains the missing soft tissue. No avalanche explains the orange skin discoloration or the lights in the sky. A second theory, which has attracted serious scientific interest in recent years, involves infrasound. Infrasound, sound below the threshold of human hearing, below roughly 20 Hz, can be produced by specific wind patterns when air flows over a curved surface, like the dome of a hill. The Kármán vortex is a known atmospheric phenomenon. When wind hits an obstacle at the right speed and angle, it produces a spinning alternation of vortices, which can generate infrasound. At certain frequencies and intensities, infrasound is not heard but felt. It produces a deep, unlocatable vibration in the body. And at higher intensities, it causes profound psychological effects. Panic, disorientation, visual disturbances, an overwhelming, animal-level sense that something terrible and invisible is present, and that immediate flight is the only rational response. Researchers who modeled the topography of Kholat Syakhl found that under the right wind conditions consistent with what meteorological records suggest for that region on that night, the slope could indeed produce infrasound in the range that causes panic. The model found that exposure might be intermittent rather than continuous, which would explain why the hikers initially fled, but then, as 3 of them appeared to be doing when they died, attempted to return. If the infrasound had stopped, the unbearable sense of dread would have lifted. They would have realized they were dying of cold and tried to get back. They would have been too late. It is a compelling theory. It might explain the behavior. But infrasound does not fracture skulls. Infrasound does not remove tongues. Infrasound does not leave radiation on clothing. There is the military testing theory. The Ural region in 1959 was a center of Soviet military and scientific activity. Missiles, rockets, nuclear programs operating in parallel secrecy. The radiation on the clothing, the strange injuries, the lights in the sky, the government's eagerness to close the investigation and seal the file. All of these point, in this theory, to some accident or experiment that the hikers witnessed or stumbled into. Perhaps a failed missile test. Perhaps an experimental weapon. Perhaps something that was never meant to reach this high into the public record, and that several levels of Soviet bureaucracy worked, with the practiced efficiency of a state that had much to hide, to ensure it did not. This theory cannot be easily dismissed. The Soviet Union was known to have tested weapons in the Ural region during this period. The KGB did take an unusual interest in the case. Documents from the investigation were removed before the family lawyers could view them. Certain witnesses who gave statements about the lights in the sky were later reportedly visited by officials who suggested, firmly, that what they had seen was not what they thought they had seen. The pattern of official behavior around the Dyatlov case is not consistent with a simple wilderness tragedy. But if it was a military accident, an explosion, a rocket, a chemical or radiological event, then the physical evidence on the bodies should tell a clearer story. Military weapons of that era produced known, documentable effects. The injuries to the Dyatlov group don't quite fit any known weapons profile. They are too strange. Too specifically strange, in the wrong direction. And so you circle back to the same point. Each theory illuminates part of the darkness. None of them illuminates all of it. Let us try to reconstruct the last hours. Not with the confidence of certainty, there is no certainty here, but with the honesty of probability, of the best guesses that the evidence allows. Sometime between 9 and 11 o'clock on the night of February 1st, 1959, something happened inside or immediately outside that tent. Something sudden. The group diary's final entry is from earlier in the day and is unremarkable. There is no screaming in any recorded account. No blood inside the tent. No sign of a fight or panic inside the tent. Whatever happened was fast enough that there was no time for the hikers to dress, to think, to discuss. Someone, perhaps Igor Dyatlov, perhaps the nearest person to the wall, made a decision in a fraction of a second. The knife went through the canvas. They ran in a group, largely together. The footprints confirm this. They ran in the direction away from the tent, down the slope toward the tree line. It was dark. The wind was up. The temperature was catastrophic. And yet they did not stop. They did not turn back. Whatever was behind them, real or perceived, physical or psychological, was worse than everything ahead. Doroshenko and Krivonischenko reached the cedar first. They built a fire. The broken branches high in the tree suggest that someone climbed it, perhaps to see what was happening above, on the slope, near the tent. Perhaps to see if it was safe. Perhaps because whatever it was had followed them, and the tree felt safer than the ground. We do not know what they saw from up there. We do not know what they felt, in the last hour before the fire died and the cold came for them. The burns on their hands are the only record of how hard they fought to stay warm. And they were not enough. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin appear to have turned back. The logic, as much as logic applies here, suggests that the fire was failing, the cold was killing them, and the tent, with its insulation, its sleeping bags, its warmth, was the only chance of survival. So they turned and went back up the slope. One by one, the cold found them before the tent did. Dyatlov died first, closest to the cedar. Then Slobodin. Then Zina, who was the farthest up the slope, nearly halfway back, close enough that under other conditions, warmer night, slower cold, a little more time, she might have made it. The last four, Thibaut Brignolel, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, did something extraordinary. They did not try to return to the tent. They did not stay at the cedar. They moved deeper into the forest, into a ravine, and they built a den. They dug into the snow. They used their own bodies for warmth, arranged themselves in the most efficient configuration they could manage. They stripped clothing from the bodies of Doroshenko and Krivonischenko, the two who had already died, and used it to try to insulate themselves further. This is not panic. This is rational, competent survival behavior. These were people who knew what they were doing. And yet 3 of the 4 had injuries that defy explanation. The crushed skull. The shattered rib cages. No external force consistent with the environment can account for those injuries in that location. They were deep in the ravine, beneath 4 meters of snow, in a position that suggests they did not die immediately after their injuries but survived for some time with them, and then the cold took them too. What injured them? This is where the trail goes cold. Literally and figuratively. The most recent forensic analyses suggest that the chest injuries are biomechanically consistent with compression, a massive, uniform force applied to the body not from one side but from multiple directions simultaneously. A weight. A collapse. Snow, densely packed, suddenly shifted, can deliver exactly this kind of injury. It is possible that the den they built partially collapsed, that the weight of several meters of snow above shifted and fell. A snow collapse would produce exactly the kind of diffuse, bone-crushing pressure that leaves internal fractures without external surface wounds. It would explain the injuries to the chest and skull without requiring any external actor. But it does not explain Dubinina's missing tongue and eyes. And it does not explain the radiation. And it does not explain why experienced, rational people in their early 20s felt compelled to run into negative 30-degree darkness without their shoes. The mystery deepened every time investigators thought they had found the floor of it. There is no floor. In 2019, the Russian prosecutor's office announced that it was reopening the investigation for the third time since 1959. The deputy prosecutor, Andrei Kuryakov, held a press conference and said that investigators had narrowed the possibilities to 3 natural explanations: avalanche, snow slab, or hurricane-level winds. He was confident. He used the language of certainty. In 2020, the official conclusion was delivered: avalanche. The families were notified. The newspapers ran the story. The case was closed again. The families were not satisfied. Yuri Kuntsevich, the head of the Dyatlov Foundation, said publicly that the avalanche conclusion was inconsistent with the evidence. That it did not explain the injuries. That it did not explain the radiation. That it did not explain the absence of avalanche debris around the tent site. That closing the file was not the same as answering the questions. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the way institutional authority handles mysteries of this kind. Mysteries where the facts are documented but the explanation remains elusive. The bureaucratic instinct is to close, to conclude, to produce a definitive statement that can be filed and forgotten. But the Dyatlov case resists this. It has resisted it for 65 years. Every time a conclusion is announced, something in the record contradicts it. Every time the file is closed, someone finds a new thread and pulls it. The case has attracted physicists and forensic pathologists and meteorologists and psychologists and military historians and professional mountaineers and conspiracy theorists and journalists and documentary filmmakers and novelists. Every discipline has approached it with its own tools and its own assumptions. Every discipline has found something that its tools can explain, and something else, just beyond reach, that they cannot. The indigenous Mansi people of the region had a name for Kholat Syakhl long before any of this happened. The name in Mansi means, approximately, the dead mountain. No one knows exactly why. One account holds that 9 Mansi hunters died on that slope in a storm many generations before 1959. 9 hunters. 9 hikers. The coincidence is the kind that your rational mind should dismiss and your deeper self refuses to. What endures about this case, what has given it its peculiar, lingering power over the decades, is not just the mystery of what happened. It is the nature of the gap between what we know and what we don't. The gap is not large in the sense of missing information. We have the tent. We have the footprints. We have the bodies. We have the medical reports, the forensic analysis, the testimony of dozens of witnesses and investigators and experts. We have more data than most historical mysteries of this kind. And we still cannot say, with confidence, what happened. That gap, so narrow in terms of data, so vast in terms of understanding, is where this case lives. It is a gap in the structure of what can be known. And sitting at the edge of that gap, you feel something that is not quite fear and not quite awe but is related to both. You feel the edge of what human inquiry can reach. And beyond that edge, the mountain simply continues. 9 people went into those mountains. Their laughter was real. Their friendships were real. Their competence and their courage were real. And then something that 65 years of investigation has not been able to name, took all of it away in a single night. Igor Dyatlov's watch was found on his wrist when they recovered him. It had stopped. The hands had frozen at a time that forensic analysis could not precisely correlate with any known event in the sequence of that night. A stopped watch on a dead man's wrist, on a slope no one should have died on, in a case no one has solved. It is not a metaphor. It is a fact. But it feels like a metaphor, for everything this case is about, everything it refuses to resolve, everything it leaves you holding. The snow on that slope is new every winter. Whatever prints it holds, whatever secrets it has accumulated in the compaction of decades, it releases them every spring and replaces them with fresh silence every fall. The mountain does not remember. Or if it does, it has no language for that memory that we can access. It simply stands there, at the edge of the human world, at the edge of what can be explained, enormous and indifferent and completely, utterly unmoved by the fact that 9 young people died at its feet one night in February 1959, and we still cannot tell you why. The last entry in the group diary was light, cheerful, even. Someone had written about the day's difficulties with the tone of a person who expects that tomorrow will be better, who believes, as competent and experienced people believe, that the next morning will come and the weather will clear and the trail will continue and everything will, eventually, be all right. The next morning did not come for them. Not in any form they recognized. There is a question that the Dyatlov Pass incident leaves unanswered that has nothing to do with radiation, or avalanches, or infrasound, or military weapons. It is a simpler question. It is a harder question. It is the question that every version of this story eventually arrives at, no matter how it begins. What did they see? In the last moments before they cut through the canvas and ran, in the fraction of a second between whatever triggered it and the knife going through the tent wall, what did they see or hear or feel or know? What was so wrong that 9 rational, experienced, physically capable adults looked at negative 30 degrees of certain death and chose it over whatever was there? We have everything but that. The tent, the footprints, the bodies, the injuries, the radiation, the missing flesh, the lights in the sky, the closed file and the open questions and the mountain that stands exactly where it has always stood, unchanged, waiting with the patience of something that has never needed to explain itself to anyone. We have everything but the one thing we need. We have everything but the answer.